On the morning of June 23, 1970, a heavily modified military transport plane touched down on a remote, wind-swept runway in Amchitka, Alaska. Inside the cargo hold, a team of anxious biologists checked the temperature of dozens of specialized wooden crates, each filled with blocks of ice and a highly unusual passenger. A few hours later, these crates were loaded onto fishing boats and transported to the jagged, fog-shrouded coastline of Washington state. There, 70 wild sea otters were released into the churning, freezing surf. They had been captured from the last remaining strongholds in the Aleutian Islands, flown thousands of miles, and dropped into an environment where their species had been completely extinct for over a century. The odds were staggeringly low. The water was rough, the animals were highly stressed, and previous attempts at translocation had ended in total disaster, with entire populations dying of shock or exposure within days. Conventional scientific wisdom predicted that these 70 pioneers would scatter, succumb to the relentless Pacific predators, or simply starve in a coastline that had adapted to their absence for generations. Everyone assumed this expensive, desperate gamble would end in a quiet, tragic failure. But that is not what happened. What actually occurred over the next few decades rewrote the textbook on marine biology, permanently altering our understanding of how the natural world heals itself. Those 70 misplaced, stressed animals were the vanguard of a massive, multi-decade reintroduction effort that would eventually see over 3,000 sea otters relocated, protected, and born across the degraded coasts of the Pacific Northwest. This is not just a story about saving a cute animal from the brink of extinction. It is the chronicle of an unprecedented ecological resurrection. First, we will explore how a thriving, ancient marine wilderness collapsed into a barren, lifeless underwater desert. Then, we will uncover the agonizing, high-stakes decisions made by scientists who risked everything to bring these creatures back. And finally, we will look at the mind-blowing, paradigm-shifting transformation that left the global scientific community absolutely speechless. A twist that no one, not even the world's leading marine ecologists, ever saw coming. To truly understand the magnitude of this comeback, you have to understand the creature at the center of it. It is not just a marine mammal, it is an ecological linchpin. It is not just a predator, it is an architect of the ocean. Weighing up to 100 pounds, the sea otter is the largest member of the weasel family, but the absolute smallest marine mammal in the world. Unlike whales, seals, or sea lions, the otter has no thick layer of blubber to keep it warm in the sub-freezing waters of the North Pacific. Instead, evolution provided them with the most dense, luxurious fur in the entire animal kingdom, a staggering 1 million hairs per square inch. To put that in perspective, that is more hair on a single square inch of an otter's body than a healthy human being has on their entire head. This fur is so dense that water never actually touches the otter's skin. They spend hours every day meticulously grooming themselves, blowing air bubbles into their coats to create a literal coat of armor against the lethal cold. But maintaining this biological furnace requires an unbelievable amount of fuel. A sea otter must consume 25 to 30% of its own body weight every single day just to survive. Imagine a human being eating 50 pounds of food a day, every day, just to stay warm. Because of this insatiable metabolism, the otter is a relentless, unstoppable foraging machine. They dive deep into the murky depths, using their highly sensitive whiskers to detect movement in the pitch-black water, and their incredibly dexterous front paws to pry loose prey from the ocean floor. They are one of the few non-human mammals on Earth known to use tools, frequently bringing a flat stone up to the surface, placing it on their chests, and smashing hard-shelled prey against it with lightning speed. They eat crabs, clams, abalone, and most importantly, sea urchins. This insatiable appetite for urchins is what makes them so vital. They are the supreme guardians of the kelp forest. Without them, the entire marine ecosystem of the Pacific coast simply ceases to exist. For thousands of years, the kelp forests of the Pacific coast were as lush, biodiverse, and majestic as the Amazon rainforest. Towering giant kelp strands grew up to 2 feet a day, reaching toward the sunlight and creating a massive three-dimensional underwater canopy. This jungle of algae provided food, shelter, and nursery grounds for hundreds of species of fish, seals, grey whales, and seabirds. It was a perfectly balanced engine of life. But then, humans intervened with catastrophic greed. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, the global fur trade exploded. The sea otter's miraculously dense fur, once reserved for royalty, became the most valuable commodity on Earth, known as soft gold. International hunting fleets from Russia, Britain, and the United States swept across the Pacific Rim with brutal efficiency. Between 1741 and 1911, an estimated 1 million sea otters were systematically slaughtered. By the turn of the 20th century, a population that once stretched continuously from Japan, around the rim of Alaska, and down to Baja California, was reduced to just a few hundred isolated individuals hiding in the most remote, inaccessible coves of the Aleutian Islands and Big Sur. Along the coastline of Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, they were completely, utterly gone. The disappearance of the sea otter triggered a terrifying ecological cascade effect that nobody predicted. Without their primary predator to keep them in check, the population of purple and red sea urchins exploded by thousands of percent. Armies of millions of spiny urchins marched across the ocean floor, devouring the holdfasts, the roots of the giant kelp. They didn't just eat the kelp, they clear-cut it. Within a matter of decades, the vibrant, emerald underwater forests were utterly decimated, replaced by what marine biologists call urchin barrens. You are looking at a landscape of pure desolation. Miles upon miles of bleached white rock covered in nothing but a carpet of starving, aggressive urchins. The fish lost their spawning grounds and vanished. The seabirds had no shelter and flew away. The seals and whales abandoned the coast. The water became turbid, choked with silt, and devoid of life. A thriving, multi-dimensional paradise had been reduced to a marine desert. It seemed completely hopeless, a permanent scar of human ignorance. Then came the lucky turn, an event born out of military secrecy and pure coincidence. In the late 1950s and 1960s, the United States government began conducting underground nuclear weapons testing on Amchitka Island in the remote Aleutians. Biologists sent to survey the impact of these massive blasts made an astonishing discovery. Hidden in the treacherous, jagged reefs surrounding the nuclear test sites was a surviving, thriving colony of several thousand sea otters. They looked wrong in the best way possible, fat, healthy, and completely packed into a landscape scientists thought was devoid of them. But the looming threat of imminent nuclear detonations meant this precious population was in grave danger. An intense, furious debate erupted within the scientific and political communities. Some argued that catching and moving these delicate, highly stressed animals across thousands of miles of ocean was a logistical nightmare that would only result in mass casualties. The costs were exorbitant, the risks were unprecedented. Others argued that doing nothing was a guaranteed death sentence for the species and the coast. Ultimately, a daring, high-stakes reintroduction plan was approved. It was executed like a covert military operation. Teams of divers braved freezing, treacherous currents to capture the otters using specialized net tents. They were rushed to holding pools, carefully dried, packed into specialized crates lined with ice to prevent their core temperatures from skyrocketing, and loaded onto military aircraft. Between 1969 and the late 1970s, across multiple operations, scientists released groups of otters into British Columbia, Washington, and southeast Alaska. In total, across these decades of effort and subsequent conservation programs, over 3,000 sea otters would be relocated or managed across these historic ranges. When those first crates were opened and the otters slipped back into the cold Pacific surf, the world held its breath. The initial years were an agonizing test of patience. The threats were real: toxic oil spills, recovering shark populations, and localized diseases were always lingering in the background, but they were never the headline. The headline was the sheer, unstoppable resilience of the otters. As the population stabilized, observers witnessed an incredible sight. The otters immediately went to work. They began consuming urchins with a ferocity that stunned researchers. In areas where otters were reintroduced, urchin numbers plummeted by over 90% in just a few years. With the urchins kept at bay, a miracle occurred. The kelp returned. Spores that had lain dormant in the dark recesses of the ocean floor suddenly found sunlight. Within a decade, massive golden-brown canopies of giant kelp broke through the surface of the water once again. The ripple effect was spectacular. Rockfish, salmon and herring returned to the newly formed kelp forests to lay their eggs. Harbour seals moved back into the bays to hunt. Bald eagles clung to the branches of coastal trees, diving down to snatch fish from the kelp canopy. The very texture of the ocean changed. The water became crystal clear as the kelp filtered out heavy sediment and slowed down the crashing force of destructive storm waves. Hope wasn't just growing, it was exploding along the coast. The hard data collected over the next 50 years confirmed a triumph of unimaginable scale. In southeast Alaska, the initial population of 400 transplanted otters exploded into a thriving wilderness of over 25,000 individuals by the 2000s. In Washington state, the population grew at a steady, beautiful rate of over 8% every year, expanding from those original survivors to a stable, robust population of several thousand. Across the entire Pacific Northwest, an area larger than the entire state of California saw its marine ecosystems radically restored. The sea otter was officially downgraded from critically endangered to stable in these core recovery zones. Humans were finally able to step back, letting the animals take over their ancient duties completely on their own. This ecological victory brought massive economic benefits too. Local coastal communities saw a surge in ecotourism, bringing millions of dollars to small towns as people traveled from all over the world just to catch a glimpse of this legendary comeback. But just as scientists were preparing to celebrate a textbook conservation success, something happened that absolutely nobody expected. It was a twist that defied every rule of sea otter biology ever written. For centuries, every scientist, textbook and academic paper explicitly stated that sea otters are strictly marine creatures that require deep, rocky ocean coastlines and massive kelp forests to survive. It was an undisputed law of nature. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scientists noticed small groups of otters doing something they shouldn't be able to do. They were leaving the outer ocean coast entirely. They were swimming deep into muddy, shallow estuaries, tidal sloughs, and salt marshes, environments completely devoid of kelp, rock, or deep water. It made absolutely no sense. Why would an animal built for the rocky outer ocean move into a shallow, muddy swamp? Initially, researchers dismissed this as an anomaly, assuming these were just rogue individuals pushed out by overcrowding. But they were completely wrong. Subtle clues had been planted years prior. Early coastal explorers had noted otters in strange places, but modern science had dismissed them. This migration was not an accident. It was a revelation that completely reframed the entire story. What we thought was the ultimate achievement, restoring the kelp forests, was actually just the first chapter of a much grander, deeper ecological truth. The sea otters weren't just ocean dwellers. They were coastal transformers on a scale no human mind had ever conceived. The definitive proof came in a groundbreaking, revolutionary study published in the prestigious journal Nature in 2024. Researchers studying the Elkhorn Slough, a massive degraded salt marsh estuary in California, uncovered a scientific marvel that left researchers in absolute shock. For decades, this vital estuary had been dying. Agricultural runoff had pumped massive amounts of nutrients into the water, causing intense algal blooms. These blooms choked out the sunlight, killing the native seagrass. Even worse, the over-nutrified water caused an explosion in the population of line shore crabs. These crabs burrowed into the muddy banks of the estuary, chewing away at the roots of the marsh plants, causing the entire shoreline to collapse and erode into the sea at an alarming rate. It was an environmental disaster that cost millions of dollars in failed engineering solutions. Then the otters arrived. The Nature study revealed that when the sea otters entered the estuary, they didn't look for kelp, they looked for crabs. The otters began eating the marsh crabs in staggering quantities. With the crab population decimated, the small, herbivorous sea slugs and snails that the crabs used to eat suddenly multiplied. These sea slugs acted as a natural cleanup crew, meticulously eating the suffocating algae off the leaves of the seagrass. The seagrass, suddenly bathed in sunlight, staged an unbelievable comeback. Its deep, complex root systems locked the muddy soil of the estuary in place. The study proved that the presence of sea otters slowed down shoreline erosion by a stunning 60 to 90%. An animal scientists thought belonged exclusively in the deep ocean had single-handedly saved a collapsing terrestrial wetland. The scientific reaction was one of pure, unadulterated awe. We had completely underestimated the profound, interconnected genius of nature. Beyond the rigorous science and the hard data, this historic comeback struck a deeply emotional, spiritual chord that resonated across generations. For the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, including the Haida, the Nuchanalth, the Makah, and the Elwha, the sea otter was never just a natural resource. They were the ku, a sacred relative, a symbol of wealth, balance, and the interconnectedness of the sea and the land. In many coastal traditions, it was believed that human beings and sea otters could communicate, and that the otters taught humans how to harvest the treasures of the ocean with respect. When the fur trade wiped out the otters, it didn't just break an ecosystem, it ripped a hole through the cultural fabric of these ancient communities. For over a century, the songs, dances, and rituals dedicated to the sea otter were performed in a painful vacuum, honoring a ghost that no living member of the tribe had ever seen in their local waters. But as the otters returned, so did the spirits of the coast. Elders who had only ever heard of the ku in whispered bedtime stories wept as they stood on the shore and watched wild otter mothers floating in the bays, wrapping their pups in strands of kelp just yards from their ancestral villages. The ancient songs were no longer elegies for the lost. They became vibrant, living anthems of renewal. The return of the otter revitalized indigenous-led marine conservation initiatives, bringing young tribal members back to the water to study, protect, and manage the resources alongside their wild relatives. The healing wasn't just ecological, it was profoundly human. It was a realization that when we repair the natural world, we repair ourselves. Ultimately, this incredible journey serves as a powerful, undeniable blueprint for the future of our planet. What began in 1970 with 70 stressed, misplaced animals in wooden crates has blossomed into a magnificent, self-sustaining empire of thousands of otters transforming entire coastlines. We didn't manually replant the thousands of acres of lost kelp forests. We didn't build multi-million-dollar concrete barriers to stop the erosion of our vital estuaries. We simply returned the animal that knew how. This story proves that rewilding is not an impossible, idealistic dream. It is a highly effective, scientifically sound reality that has the power to reverse decades of human destruction in a matter of years. It challenges us to look at the world around us not as a collection of isolated resources to be managed, but as a beautiful, deeply interconnected web of life, where every single creature has a vital, indispensable role to play. If a small, fragile marine mammal can face absolute extinction and return to single-handedly heal an entire ocean coast, imagine what is possible if we apply that same faith, dedication, and respect to the rest of our broken world. The wilderness is not gone forever. It is simply waiting for us to give it a chance to come home. What do you think is the most surprising way nature can heal itself when we step out of the way? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of ecological resurrection inspired you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of nature's resilience, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most incredible wildlife comebacks. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.